Welcome to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. In this episode, I'm talking to Simon Moss, the Dean at the University of Wollengong in Australia, and also a psychologist. He has recently launched a venture called radicalhumility.com, which essentially aims to foster humility, nullify narcissism, and end entitlement, which research suggests can be the main source of many of the problems that middle-aged men experience, from domestic violence and bullying to car accidents and limited productivity. So welcome, Simon.
Thank you so much for having me. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Brilliant. Okay, well, perhaps I can start by asking you what inspired you to create Radical Humility? And, was there a personal turning point for you?
Yes. It probably almost began about 30 years ago. That's when I started in academia and psychology. Realized I didn't know anything, but did know that people were really struggling. Life wasn't easy. There was a lot of people experiencing mental health problems and just life issues and relationship problems. And so I just assumed that maybe our natural intuitions or hunches that guide our decisions and behaviors are often possibly a bit flawed. Otherwise, we'd be happy. And so I became interested in trying to explore this possibility. And so I decided to try to find every scientific discovery that sort of contradicts common wisdom, that sort of contradicts how we do things, that's sort of counterintuitive or unintuitive. So, for example, I discovered that if people are closer to your left shoulder, then you tend to read them better. You can accommodate them better. For some reason, we just process them better because we process them with our right hemisphere or something like that. And then after about 20 to 30 years of collecting these findings, sort of discovered there was a pattern or theme. And the basic theme was that generally people struggled whenever their main motivation was just to increase their status or reputation immediately, rather than try to sort of develop skills or resources for the future. That became my interest. And essentially, that's sort of is essentially similar to showing that actually when people are really obsessed with themselves now, which is very similar to narcissism, as opposed to planning on developing skills for the future, which is very similar to humility, then they tend to struggle. So that became a turning point that sort of highlighted that perhaps humility, as opposed to narcissism, might be an answer to many of the problems and struggles that people are experiencing.
And so how do you define humility? Some men might confuse it with weakness, for example.
That's right. Well, so basically, humility really is this passion for learning from other people or experiences. But what that looks like is people who, for example, are quite happy to acknowledge their limitations and faults, both to themselves and other people, but also tend to be very aware of their strengths, something I'll talk about in a moment. They're people who are quite comfortable recognizing that some of their beliefs might be misguided or biased. And they're really quite open, even excited when they hear perspectives that differ from their own. And also they really just appreciate other people and even the world. And it's, as you say, it's not the same as weakness or vulnerability or anything like that. Well, certainly not weakness. And indeed, the research suggests that actually people who are humble often seem a lot more confident and assured and even have credibility for a whole range of reasons. One is the fact that when people are humble, they've often thought about perspectives from many different ways. And so they're a lot more considered. They're not as defensive, so they seem more composed rather than concerned when someone challenges them. And they also tend to ask questions. And there's some research suggests that when you ask questions about a topic, you actually seem smarter rather than dumber, particularly if the topic is quite a complicated one. And as I mentioned before, humble people also are actually more aware of their own strengths. And that's probably because they're very open to feedback. They're very open to information about themselves because they're interested in that information. They want to learn and they want to develop. So as a consequence of that, they're even more aware of their talents and strengths, as opposed to someone who may not be humble and who might be narcissistic instead.
So how might you, if you're listening to this, how might you recognize some of the signs in your behavior? You've talked about linking narcissism and entitlement to things like burnout, relationship breakdowns, even things like car accidents. How would people recognize themselves, recognize symptoms, if you like, if they're listening to this?
Oh, look, and there's lots of different symptoms of narcissism. And because some people might be listening and thinking, oh, look, that's not me. I'm narcissistic. I'm a pretty reasonable person. But the truth is, we all experience some elements of narcissism from time to time. And it's up to all of us to try to sort of diminish those and embrace humility. And it can manifest in many different ways. So, for example, some studies show that one little cue to the fact that you might be a bit narcissistic at times is when you start obsessively looking in the mirror. In fact, there are studies that try to test narcissism by just determining how likely it is you're going to look in a mirror when you have an opportunity. Because narcissistic people are often a little bit more obsessed about appearance, for example. But I mean, another one would be that they often just feel that they should or deserve to be treated better. So an example might be if you're in an airport and you're hearing that all these flights are delayed or cancelled, it doesn't bother you until your flight is cancelled. And suddenly you just feel, well, this is just unjust. I mean, it just seems so unfair. Like, don't they know who I am? And you know that thought's ridiculous, but suddenly you just feel like you've been treated badly, that you deserve better. And this really is a potential sign of narcissism. And it just increases often aggressive thoughts and behaviors. Another one is that you often hear a narcissistic person, when they're sort of criticized or challenged, say something like, oh, look, you just humiliated me. This is a type of narcissism called vulnerable narcissism, which is people who are very, very sensitive to criticism. They often feel humiliated, even when really it was just a very simple question or a comment that made them very upset. And so as a consequence of that, narcissistic people are often very sensitive to feelings of shame. And because of that shame, they might be more susceptible to substance abuse, alcohol intake, or even retribution of other people, for example. So it can manifest in other ways. I mean, another way is where people just think that they're really good at things that you can't really be that good at. So they might really think they're good at gambling. They're just really good at it. I mean, it's, I don't know why. I mean, for example, if they're playing a game of with dice, they will always roll the dice themselves. They would never let someone else roll the dice because clearly they know how to roll it better. Or they just think that they can drive better. And some of them can, of course, but many people can't. And so because of that, they'll often take risks, increasing likelihood of gambling, very fast driving, and those sorts of problems as well. And also, they often sort of think that, look, they should be the leader. I mean, not always, but sometimes they feel they should be the leader. So at work, for example, they're not usually going to be as respectful to a leader, at least if that leader's not particularly close to them. And so they'll often feel that there's an injustice, that they should be in that position. And because of that injustice, they might not work as effectively. They don't really sacrifice to improve the organization and so forth.
And how about linking it to burnout, perhaps in the corporate environment? So you were talking just then about perhaps thinking that, entitlement, that you should be the boss. But how does that relate to burnout?
Yeah, in a number of ways. I mean, one is the fact that often they don't really have that real sense of sort of meaning, that's something that's really purposeful. And the reason for that, it's when we're humble, that's when we really appreciate the lives and experiences and challenges of other people. So we become much more motivated to find opportunities to support others. And as a consequence, we often feel a sense of meaning in what we're doing. And that sense of meaning just compels us, and it becomes almost natural to work hard. But if people don't experience that sense of meaning, to thrive, they need to push themselves. Like it's not as natural. But working hard is a harder thing for them to do. And that feeling of always pushing themselves, increases the likelihood of burnout, as one example. But there are several other reasons as well. Part of it also is that, narcissistic people really want to be admired. That's really quite important to them. So they'll often work very hard to do something to be admired, which often means they're acting in ways that are designed to impress someone else, rather than really necessarily driven by what feels natural to them. And that need to impress someone else and always undertake activities that they don't really want to undertake, they're just doing for the glory, also increases the likelihood of burnout as well, and can increase other sort of related issues like workaholism.
And things like, if you approach a more humble existence, I imagine things like anxiety and perhaps even unfulfillment become a bit lessened or disappear because, you're viewing things perhaps with a different lens.
Well, that's right. Suddenly, your main goal is to learn and develop. And the beauty about that is you can do that at any moment. Any moment feels like you can develop. So if you're criticized, if you're challenged, if something goes wrong, you just automatically perceive that as an opportunity. I mean, everyone knows that they probably should do that, right? They'd love to see difficulties and challenges as an opportunity. But in practice, we might pretend that we feel that way, but actually we feel slighted or disappointed when we fail. If someone is humble and they're really trying to learn and develop from other people, they almost sort of like things going wrong. It's an opportunity to grow. They feel so fascinated by the circumstances.
And so I guess also you talked a bit there about propensity, I guess, for risk with things like gambling and perhaps substance abuse. And so does that then lead to that kind of risk taking? Does that lead to, things like car accidents and if you put yourself through more risk, then you're more likely to, encounter some of these sorts of incidents?
Well, that's exactly right. I think that because they're so likely to overestimate their capabilities and underestimate their risks, they'll engage in behaviours that anyone else would recognise may be inappropriate. A lot of risky behaviours, a lot of hasty behaviours. They're more likely to, or less likely to be able to resist temptations as well. So they tend to engage a bit more impulsively in life.
And you talked as well about domestic abuse. I mean, what's the link there?
Look, there's probably a number of reasons. I mean, some of it is just that sense that, they want to be listened to. It's very important to be the center of attention. So they often sort of feel that they're not being taken seriously enough. So that can be one aspect. And they might even say things like, "You're just not listening to me," even when the person is. So they're very easy to get angry. It might be, as I said before, they're very, very susceptible to criticism. And they'll see criticism in even sort of the most mild comments. So they'll sort of often become enraged in response to what is, a reasonable request. So that can often generate issues like domestic violence and so forth. But they also sort of feel entitled. They feel they deserve more. They feel like that person, should be dedicating their life to me. So they're often going to be disappointed as well.
So what do you think is the cause of these behaviours? And I'm talking, more at a macro level here. So, culturally or socially, what are the triggers or drivers here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me start with sort of the micro level in a sense, which is the notion that a lot of these sort of narcissistic behaviours where people like to exaggerate how good they are, to themselves and others, or they like to undermine other people to put them down. The reason that often happens is because for a moment, people feel better. So, if people are struggling in life a little bit, if they're a bit stressed, they're anxious, distressed, even a bit depressed, then they'll often feel better when they act narcissistic for a moment. When they, as I say, mock someone else as an example. It just makes them feel better about who they are in comparison. And so it becomes reinforcing because for a moment, it makes them feel better. The problem is that although narcissistic acts like this can improve their emotions for the immediate term, it tends to have long-term consequences. So as I sort of implied before, that narcissism will undermine their resilience because they become very sensitive to criticisms or problems. It'll undermine their relationships because they just don't seem trustworthy. And it'll undermine their reputation because they seem quite defensive. So it has long-term problems, but short-term benefits. But it creates a vicious cycle because they're experiencing so many of these long-term problems, these problems with their relationships, problems with their reputation. They're experiencing a lot of negative emotions. And the only thing they've learned to do, either from watching others or because of their own experience, is to be more narcissistic. So it creates a bit of a vicious cycle. So that's how it works on an individual level. Probably what's more interesting is even from a more societal level, because one of the reasons there is a lot of narcissism in society, well, there's a number of reasons, but one is also the fact that it seems to be sort of reinforced. There are a lot of narcissistic leaders. And so it's almost something like people learn to act a bit narcissistically because often people who have experienced success are also narcissistic. And that's interesting in its own right. Why is it happening that there are so many narcissistic leaders? Not everyone, of course. And of course, as I said, narcissism is a continuum and we all experience it at times. But why does it happen so much? And there's a number of reasons. I mean, one, of course, is that during interviews, when you're interviewing, say, a new leader, you tend to believe them. It's interesting. We always assume that, we're quite discerning, but most people believe what someone else is telling us. It's called the truth bias. And so if you've got someone narcissistic in an interview who's gravely exaggerating their strengths and contributions, you tend to believe them. So they'll often thrive in interviews, but not thrive in the job later, as an example. And then probably the final reason that's really interesting is that we tend to be more narcissistic when the world's very unstable. And the reason for that is that when the world is stable, in the sense that we sort of know what our job's going to be and what our life's going to be and our circumstances are going to be in, say, 5 to 10 years, then our main motivation is to develop the skills and the resource, the networks we need for the future. But when life seems very uncertain, we just can't imagine what our life will be even in a few days, because jobs are changing all over the place. AI and converging technologies are really fundamentally shifting the landscape. In those situations, we're not as motivated to improve our skills for the future because we don't know what that future holds for us. The future just seems so distant and dissociated. It doesn't feel real to us. It doesn't feel close to us. And so as a consequence of that, our humility drops. We're not as interested in learning. And so we become more narcissistic as a consequence. And I think that's one of the reasons why narcissism tends to be increasing. It has been increasing really across society for about 30 years or so. Yeah, exacerbated by issues like social media and so forth that almost enforce narcissism in some ways.
So the terms narcissism and, entitlement, they don't get a great press, do they? So, naturally, you perhaps would think that, well, if someone's a narcissist or, hopefully entitled, they're a really bad person, But actually, I guess from what you're saying, they're quite normal reactions to, external stimuli.
Oh, I think that's right. They're normal in that sense. It's understandable. It's often designed to help them really manage their own emotions, although I don't think it's effective in the long term. It can be in the short term. It's something that we all experience from time to time, but also it's not always detrimental. I mean, we have to be honest about this. There are nuances. So, for example, usually narcissistic leaders create problems, but sometimes they work well with other narcissistic staff. They sometimes can increase the creativity of those staff, and they sometimes perform well when they're in a position to be admired, because narcissistic people really want to be admired. It's so important to them. And so when there's an opportunity to be admired, when an opportunity to really engage in a challenging task and be glorified as a consequence, they can perform well. So although I wouldn't suggest people act narcissistically, I think there's so much power in humility. It really helps us psychologically. It doesn't mean that narcissism has sort of no benefits whatsoever.
I'm sure by this point, many of us are thinking, oh, I think I know. I know someone in my life who displays some of these characteristics, or maybe in yourself. I wanted to talk a bit about kind of ego and how that fits into things, because, everyone has an ego. A bad thing. It's a perfectly normal part of being a human being. So how does that relate then to what we're talking about here?
I think it relates very closely in the sense that, as you say, there's inevitability about it. But what really epitomizes someone who is humble is the sense that their ego just doesn't seem as important. They're not quite as obsessed with themselves. They really feel that way. They really feel this great, genuine passion to help other people and learn from other people. I should say that passion to learn from other people and to help other people, that altruism that corresponds to humility, is only subtly different to the altruism we often see that corresponds to narcissism. So what's really interesting is to show that actually narcissistic people aren't always seemingly selfish. For example, some research suggests that people who are more narcissistic, generally speaking, are more likely, rather than less likely, to engage in activism, like political activism and that sort of thing. They don't necessarily engage in activism for the right reasons. So they might be engaged in some maybe environmental movement or some other protest. And they often usually do it more to make themselves feel special and righteous and important. But they do often engage in those movements. In contrast, a humble person might also engage in those movements, but for very different reasons. It's not about their ego. It's not about them. They just genuinely feel this sense of connection with people around them. And so it really changes the way they help. And indeed, some research indicates that although narcissistic and humble people could seem to be altruistic, humble people do it better. They help people in a way that really helps those individuals. Where narcissistic people might help people, but in a way that actually undermines their independence. It isn't really good for them, but makes them look good.
So could this kind of, if you're midlife, perhaps in a job that you don't enjoy, or you're not particularly fulfilled, you're feeling a bit stuck, I guess this is kind of a way of unblocking things a bit, just changing your approach to life in general and the way that you look to the future. But we live in a kind of culture that does prize dominance, control. I mean, that's quite an overarching, force in the world we live in. So how can men, listening to this, how can they start to embrace this, humility or vulnerability as a strength?
Yeah. So there's probably 3 steps. The first step is just to be aware that narcissism will really enhance their resilience and reputation. So just to understand it and believe it. Because often people don't engage in humility simply because they just don't think it's useful. But when they learn that actually humility enhances resilience, relationships, and their reputation, and they learn why, obviously they're much more likely to embrace that possibility. And then the second step, once they're convinced by that, and they recognize and resolve some of the counter arguments for why that might not be the case, then the next step is really just to sort of learn to practice a bit of humility, right? It's pretty straightforward. I mean, that usually just involves occasionally, acknowledging something they might be grappling with and seeking advice. Nothing more than that. But then gradually trying to do that in more and more circumstances. Everyone can be humble in some circumstances when they're feeling good about themselves, when they're speaking to someone they trust. But then gradually it's about trying to show that humility, acknowledging some of their challenges, seeking advice, listening to diverging ideas in situations where they might be feeling a bit threatened and they might be feeling a bit uncomfortable to someone who's a bit different to them, maybe even during a conflict. So that's the second step, just practicing it. And then the third step, which takes a lot longer, is to try to understand and foster the causes of humility. So rather than just trying to act humble, people need to realize that actually we're naturally humble in certain circumstances. So just to give you one example, when we're feeling really rushed, and we're just feeling completely overwhelmed, our main motivation is just to get things done and not to learn and not to be humble. But when we just sometimes feel like we have a bit of time, and however we manage that time, we might decide that we're just trying to achieve a bit less in that day or give ourselves a bit of time to reflect or whatever it might be. But whenever we feel we have a bit more time, then naturally we just experience this motivation to learn and develop. We feel like we have the time to learn and develop our skills and knowledge for the future, and we become more humble almost as a consequence. And there's about sort of 6 or 7 main causes that just naturally foster this humility so that people will be more humble rather than narcissistic, even in these more sort of stressful circumstances. And I should sort of mention, and this is not a commercial plug, but I do have a website for this purpose. And it's all free and so forth. Of course, there's probably many other resources people can use, but we do have a website which just has a whole series of some of the activities and exercises that people can actually undertake with themselves or with others in a team that just foster this humility over time in a more sustainable way.
And that's called Radical Humility. And we'll put the link in the notes as well.
Yeah, that's right. That'd be great. Yeah, thank you.
So for people listening to this who know, they're around, perhaps narcissistic men or people that, they're recognizing some of the signs that you're talking about, partners, friends, colleagues, how can they help, without, enabling or confronting in harmful ways? What can they do?
And so I suppose the question is, how can you change someone in your life who's narcissistic and creating problems? Because we all have those people. It could be a friend, a relative, a neighbor, a boss, and so forth. And obviously, it's hard to change people dramatically and quickly, but you can gradually shape people over time. And narcissistic people are particularly easy to shape over time because in some ways, they're very transparent. We know exactly what they want. And what they want is status and admiration. They want to be associated with the elite. They want to be a leader. They want to be admired. It's quite straightforward. So the question is, how can we reward them with what they want when they're acting humble? So, for example, one strategy is to really try to prompt them to be humble and then reward them with admiration. So an example would be you could ask someone like, look, have you ever committed a mistake at work? And if you use the word ever or any or something like that, it almost forces people to say yes. It's very hard to say, no, I've never committed a mistake. Even the most narcissistic person would probably be happy to acknowledge at least one error in their life. And when they do that, you could say something like, "Oh, look, yeah, I really admire the fact that you're aware of some of your errors." And even just a simple reward like that, as long as you're someone they may respect, can be very, very useful. In addition to that, you can also try to highlight how humility could increase their status in a subtle way. So, you might say something to them, for example, if they're a colleague at work, something like, "Oh, look, it seems to me that some of your staff just don't really appreciate you enough, I sometimes feel. And I'm sort of wondering, given you're a bit of a role model to them, I wonder if you should sort of role model how it's so important to listen to diverse views. Because if you do it, maybe your staff will listen to you better," as an example. So you're sort of trying to reward them as highlighting their leadership, but you're also trying to encourage them to be humble as a way of reinforcing that leadership and admiration as a consequence. But sometimes it might be a bit more subtle than that. So, for example, as I mentioned before, most narcissistic people, particularly those on the category called vulnerable narcissists, they love mocking and deriding other people. It makes themselves feel good. So you can do that too, but you can actually mock other people's narcissism with them. So you might say, "Oh, isn't it just ridiculous? That person is just too proud to admit that they're not perfect. It's pathetic, isn't it?" And they'll like that because, yes, they might be narcissistic, but they'll still like the fact that you're mocking someone else. And they might also start to mock some of those behaviors. And it starts to become a little bit more sensitive to the notion that actually some of those behaviors that occasionally show, are worthy of derision. So there are strategies that can be quite useful for sort of gradually shaping some of their behaviors over time.
So do you think the world would be a more comfortable, safer place if some of our leaders adopted a more humble approach?
I don't think there's any doubt. I genuinely feel that so many of the problems that people are experiencing, both individually but as a society, can be ascribed often to narcissistic leaders. And actually something I found that was quite interesting the other day, which was that not only are narcissistic leaders more likely to improve society and productivity and those sorts of things, they're actually more likely to be liked, which I know seems a bit surprising because I think most of us can name leaders around the globe that don't seem at all, and political leaders as well, that don't seem at all humble, that seem quite the reverse.
Couldn't guess who you're talking about.
I won't necessarily put any words in your mouth, but actually I'm going to have to with the example of the study here, because the study actually was in America, and they actually asked people to rate the humility of their political leaders. And this is when Biden and Trump were competing for presidency. And what they found is that, firstly, people wanted a humble leader. Not everyone, but it was something they generally said, "I'll prefer a humble leader to a non-humble leader." And then what they found is that they actually, their belief of which leader was humble depended on their political affiliation. So Republican voters tended to see Trump as more humble than Biden, or at least more humble than the Democrats saw him. And the Democrats obviously saw Biden as more humble. So it is interesting that even though some people might think that some of these leaders, and there's obviously some that don't seem to epitomize humility, most people still value that quality. And that's nice for political leaders to know that actually it is still in their interest to show humility in a particular way that really resonates with the public.
And so in the kind of workplace, do you think if you want to be successful, if you want to be in the top table, do you think, the world we live in at the moment, do you think you can be humble and still be, leading organizations or have senior positions in organizations?
Look, absolutely. I mean, and there is evidence that humble leaders tend to thrive, they tend to succeed, and they tend to be in their roles for longer. And this is not new research. There's been, various research, such as the book Good to Great, for example, that's sort of shown the benefits of humility and conviction. And indeed, my argument would be that it's likely that humility will be perceived as much more valuable even in the future than it was in the past, for a whole range of reasons. One of the reasons, of course, is that we're much more likely to be overwhelmed with misinformation now. And we do know, and there's research that suggests this, and we all sense it in ourselves, that humble people are less likely to be a source of misinformation. So we're looking for that trust. We have better tools now to identify humble people. So I think for many years, employers knew that humble people were often better employees, but they didn't really have a very easy way of identifying humility. But that's changed now. We can easily identify the level of humility that people show, even from their social media. It's very easy to extract and scrape social media, place that into particular algorithms to estimate the likely humility of people. And similarly, the fact is that we now are so much more reliant on AI and other technologies, which suggests that what we might be lacking, or what is a much more scarce skill that really differentiates us from AI, is the capacity to develop those sort of trusting, genuine, empathic relationships. And the research does suggest is that when we're looking for someone to trust, when we're looking to develop a good relationship, we just naturally assess their humility. We might not do that consciously, but we're just very much drawn to those people who are humble because they tend to be more trustworthy. And that's something that I think we're going to value probably more rather than even less in future years.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because, core skills that employers or that we need in life really are changing, aren't they? As you've just been saying. And, there's fear that AI is going to make us all redundant, but actually these sorts of skills are core to kind of the future that we're going to live in. That's really interesting. What if you could offer, one message to, men the midlife struggling with, control or anger or emptiness or unfulfillment, what would that message be to them?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that the one message would be that it is worth trying to practice humility just a little bit every week. So, read about some of the exercise and activities that promote that humility and just try them occasionally, but regularly, and plan to do that indefinitely. And the reason for that is that when people decide that they're going to complete some task for the rest of their lives, they suddenly feel this sense of stability and continuity. The world doesn't quite feel as erratic. They feel that there's some sort of something that's going to last forever. And as I mentioned before, when the world feels a little bit more continuous rather than unstable and fickle, people are naturally more humble. But it's also important to practice that every day because, as I also implied, we can easily act humble, but that fundamental urge to learn from other people, respect other people, and learn from experiences is something that takes a long time to entrench to such a degree that it's retained even when we're under stress in a conflict or a difficult circumstance. So it does take a lot of practice. It's easy to pretend to be humble. It's hard to maintain it. And so it does take a lot of practice. And so as an example of a sort of exercise, even spending 5 minutes thinking about the one or two people in your life that will support you unconditionally. But even just that moment of thinking about that has been shown to promote what we call self-compassion, where we're more compassionate to ourselves. And that self-compassion has also been shown to diminish narcissism as well. Whereas, even though you think you would do that naturally, so often when we're thinking about people, even close people, we're actually thinking about people who can be quite judgmental. Even some of our close relatives and friends, they can be quite difficult. But just deliberately thinking about the people who are always supportive, tends to enhance our humility and reduce narcissism.
And let me ask you one last question. Do you think there's a, changing tide? Are people becoming more humble? Do you think is this becoming more important in society and recognized by people? Do you see that not just in Australia, but, around the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I suppose that there is a trend for narcissism to be increasing. And as a consequence of that, there probably does seem to be almost a counter movement in response to that narcissism. People are talking about narcissism more, they're talking about it much more as a problem. And so therefore, there are sort of more and more movements and groups interested in humility. But in addition to that, what I'm hoping is there'll be more and more tools in the future that will actually promote this humility. So just as an example, what I would hope in the future, and something like this might happen, is that there'll be social media platforms that will actually recognize and reward humble posts. I could imagine a social media platform thinking, look, people are just sick and tired of very narcissistic, misinformed information. They really want to hear from people who are humble, because humble people, when they talk, will tend to talk accurately and reasonably, and in a fairly objective way. And so I could imagine social media platforms, which can easily already do that, rewarding and placing more attention towards those particular posts, humble posts, or to people that seem to act humbly, or to people that have even completed courses in humility, because that's something that might happen in the future. And then as a consequence, humility is being rewarded. And so that'll actually then hopefully inspire more and more other people to act humbly as well. So, when I'm talking to people that I coach or so forth, I'll often encourage them that even if they don't feel that way, always try to epitomize humility in social media or other platforms, because that actually could be a very important index for your future reputation and job prospects as well.
Well, thank you, Simon. This has been a really fascinating discussion. And thank you for coming on and talking to us all. So, Simon, thanks very much for your time.
No, thank you so much. And, thank you for your interest.
Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. If you want to find out more about Simon's movement to nullify narcissism and end entitlement, then visit his website, radical-humility.com, where you'll find lots of information, including freely available videos and lots of other useful content. To help raise the profile of this podcast, it would really help if you could leave a rating or review on your chosen platform. And please do promote it to your own networks, and really helps to expand the reach of these stories. Finally, there's now a book called Men Speak Up, Journeys Through Mental Health, based on some of the stories from the podcast, and it's available to buy on Amazon and through other online retailers.